Technology is everywhere, and so should a systematic philosophical reflection on technology. The Working Group on Philosophy of Technology, WGPT, at the University of Leuven in Belgium aims to create a platform to do precisely that. You're listening to WGPTalks, a series where we give the opportunity to our own members to talk about what fascinates them at the crossroads of technology and society. Today we talk with Stefan Ramaekers on parenting apps. We all know how technology is deeply affecting the lives of our children. What would they be without a smartphone, a laptop, and so on? But technology is also changing the lives of their parents, as parents. And one way in which this happens is through so-called parenting apps. Stefan Ramaekers, who is a professor in education, culture and society at the KU Leuven and a member of the working group, is with us today to explain his fascination with these apps. Welcome, Stefan. I think most people will only have a vague notion of what parenting apps are. Could you explain what they're all about?
So let me first start with a fictional example, because the fictional example, I think, captures it, my fascination with these parenting apps, I think, most clearly. The fictional example is a technology that is shown in one of the episodes of the popular series Black Mirror, and the episode is called Archangel. Archangel in that episode is a company, and that company has developed a technology, a particular chip that they can implant into children's brains. And when it is implanted in children's brains, parents can then, on a tablet, see what their child is seeing. So seeing through their children's eyes. And other features of the tablet are that parents receive information about physiological states. For example, one of the features that is explained in the episode is the cortisol level and the stress levels of your child. And when cortisol levels rise to a certain extent, parents can then perform certain operations so that, for example, distressing situations that their children see are blurred. So they can blur what children see, cover up reality, so to speak. Now, I find it a very fascinating example of a technology that we do not have now, but who knows, maybe in the future. You could picture this a bit as a Google glasses, but then permanently fixed in the brain. We don't have that, but there is a technology that mediates the relationship between the parent in that episode and the child. Because a lot of things happen then in the episode. We can raise issues about privacy, etc. But my interest here is in what it does with how we think about what parents should do and what good parents are supposed to do in relation to their children. And this particular example is so fascinating because it works on a kind of fantasy of parents that you sometimes want to really know what your child is feeling and seeing.
That is indeed a very provocative example, and all things go wrong in the episodes. But that is a mere fiction, a kind of future utopia for some, dystopia for others. But do these kind of apps that monitor and want to control children and their behavior already exist?
There are numerous apps available on the market, and many examples can be given. But the apps have names such as Parenting Quiz, ParentTune, Vroom is one of the apps, Watchanga, I don't think that one exists anymore, etc. I mean, all kinds of parenting apps. Just go to the Google Store and just type in parenting apps. You will find dozens of parenting apps. What these parenting apps are in itself is that the basic structure usually is that you enter the date of birth of your child and some basic data, like the weight, the height, etc. And then you can feed the app continuously while your child grows up. And then you receive as a parent push messages which come at certain specific points, but which are also tailored to the data that you have entered into the app. Now, this is one particular format, but besides those apps, there are numerous surveillance apps that you can install on your child's smartphone. I once came across this wonderful example, I think in the American context, which was called Moto Safety, which offers you as a parent real-time feedback on your child's driving habits. So there are numerous apps available, numerous devices available that allow you in a combined way, so to speak, to perform a very thoroughgoing surveillance on your child.
So these apps are not only there for toddlers, but also for more grown-up children, as you said, who are already there to drive on their own, etc.?
I mean, I haven't done like a thorough empirical study of this, but most of the apps available seem to be for the ages 0 to 3 years, 0 to 5 years. But there are also apps available for older children and teenagers, and then they differ a bit. I mean, it's obviously not anymore with entering data about feeding times or sleeping times when you're working with apps for older children. But the fact that there are so many apps for those first 3 to 5 years has exactly to do with the particular kind of discourse that's around on parenting. And one of the features of that discourse is that as a parent, you basically have to do it right during the first 3 years, the magical first 1,000 days. And that's part of the discourse, because that's when you do the basic wiring of your child's brain. That's when you do the basic work in your child. So the first years are the most important years for parents. That's part of that discourse. And hence the availability of those kinds of apps more than apps for later stages.
And if I understood it correctly, there are also apps for even younger children, like unborn children. There are also numerous apps that guide the pregnancy with milestones and all these related push notifications.
So thank you for mentioning, for giving me that word here, mentioning the word milestones. So because that is an interesting word to use here. So mainly the knowledge available or made available in the apps is based on developmental psychology. So in developmental psychology standardly works with milestones, steps that children take. At a certain age, your child is able to do this. At a certain age, your child, for example, develops these and those social skills, etc., etc. So that forms the basic structure of these apps. And it's on the basis of those milestones available in the app and the data inputted by parents that these apps work. So automatically you get messages. For example, your child is at an age now where he or she enjoys listening to hearing you read stories. And even if it stops there, there is a certain suggestion to parents, obviously, that, okay, so maybe it's best that I now start reading stories because my child enjoys that and it's best for their development that I do that. So these messages, these push messages, are expressive of a certain kind of soft totalitarianism or a nudging. They make parents do certain things. And also it gives an image, a picture, an idea of what a good parent is. Apparently a good parent is a parent who's reading with their children.
I was indeed wondering on what these notifications are based. Who determines when the child is supposed, indeed, as you say, start enjoying to listen to stories or should start reading him or herself. So it's based on psychology and pedagogical sciences, the newest theories, but who determines which theories?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know who makes the decisions. I mean, I can't tell, but most of the apps have this generic body of knowledge, which is based on psychology, neuropsychology. And this generic body of knowledge is also the stuff that you can find in textbooks, recent classic textbooks, traditional textbooks in developmental psychology or neuropsychology. But to be honest, I don't know exactly who makes a decision. Is it the developer or is there a scientist involved? What I do find interesting in relation to the science here is that many of these apps, when you search for them, for example, the Google store, the description of these apps usually entails a reference to its scientific basis. So the knowledge available is scientifically validated, it's verified, or there's a group of experts who have been working on this and put all their knowledge into the app. So there is a strong sense that is conveyed to parents when you download this stuff and use it. We ensure you that what you do is based on good science. And it's interesting to see that because it, again, produces a certain kind of understanding of what a good parent is. A good parent is apparently someone who is able to and who is willing to act in relation to his child on the basis of the latest scientific findings.
There is indeed not just a descriptive level, but a normative implication.
There is. This is an interesting discussion as well. So this is a discussion of the so-called normativity of developmental psychology. This is a general, I guess, discussion in the philosophy of science about the so-called neutrality of facts and the neutrality of so-called findings. If I may make a reference to what I find is a really, really interesting book. It's a book by Erica Berman, which is called Deconstructing Developmental Psychology. She's a developmental psychologist herself, but also a very interesting scholar in the critical discourse studies. And she has provided very deep analyses and very interesting examples of how developmental psychological findings are, let's say, biased or produced in a particular way because of the subjects that are chosen in the research. And most of the developmental so-called milestones, etc., are constructed, produced on the basis of research with predominantly white, young, male respondent subjects. That's a particular kind of group of this world, which then becomes the norm for the rest. She speaks of the naturalizing of those data. So what is found in particular kinds of developmental research is then naturalized and becomes the norm, becomes natural for all children. And she deconstructs the discourse of developmental psychology for me in a very convincing way. And that kind of normativity is something that is simply, I think, not conveyed sufficiently enough to the general audience. We convey this image to the audience that science is real knowledge. There is no bias there. But I hope if we have learned anything from the pandemic is that even virologists, epidemiologists, etc., have shown in a very good way that science necessarily works with uncertainties and with presuppositions.
So these apps have been proliferating in our society, but they must have at least also advantages. What are the reasons why people want to use these apps?
Well, you got me there. I mean, this is something for me that I still have to look into, to be honest. Honestly, I'm not sure why parents would use that, other than the more general, generic explanation that I can give is that over a very brief period of time, we have developed our lives, constructed part of our lives, mainly around that device, the smartphone. And parenting apps, in that sense, have, I think, just developed because they are part of the flow in there. To put it a bit in a more negative sense, I guess, is that we in general, I guess, have over the last couple of years have accessed the world less through books and newspapers, but we access the world through the news feeds that we have in our smartphone. We access the world through the apps that we have. Just to give a very silly example, my youngest child, who's 15, I don't think he has ever used, let alone seen, the old telephone book, like the yellow and the white pages that you, I guess, still remember as well. They just don't, I've never seen it, never used that. So the way we access changed fundamentally. Now, parenting apps, the visualization of that, the nice interfaces that they have, obviously that there is a certain form of attraction to that.
I'm mainly asking that question because implicitly, but we haven't made it explicit yet, you seem to be very negative about these parenting apps, that there is something wrong with them. What is wrong with these parenting apps? Why are they a negative development and not a positive development?
Okay, so now I need to go into what for me is my understanding of what it means to raise children. And I want to make a distinction between parenting on the one hand and upbringing and raising children on the other hand. Parenting is a very specific way, and I would say a narrowed way of thinking about raising children. First of all, it's encapsulated in the word itself. It focuses on the parent and what the parent is doing. So on this first conceptual level, it's clear that raising children, upbringing, is there narrowed to something that a parent does. That's the first step of narrowing down. And what the parent then does or is supposed to do is, as I've already referred to in the discussion on parenting apps, is mainly based on particular pieces of advice, which are in themselves based on neuropsychology, psychology, developmental psychology. So parenting basically is, you could say, a behaviorist reduction of what it means to raise children. Let me give you one very, very simple example. On a regular basis, we have a discussion here in Belgium about the so-called disciplining children with like a small slap on the fingers or a slap on the bottom. It's really not like beating up your children, but it's like a disciplining by a small slap on the bottom or a slap on the fingers. Huge discussion about it for good reasons. But the discussion sometimes is concluded by saying it's not allowed to do that to your children because it has negative effects on their well-being, for example. It has negative effects on their development of a form of confidence. So that's usually how the discussion is concluded. But suppose now that it doesn't have negative effects or that it has positive effects. 10 years ago, I read this piece of research that claimed that adults who had been disciplined in that way when they were young children were actually more successful in their adult life than adults who were not disciplined in those ways. So my point being, I think you can only resolve this discussion by looking at what we think in terms of ethical terms about what is acceptable to do in relation to our children. So it's not just about the behavior and the outcome, it's about what we find acceptable to do in relation to children and what our understanding of being a child is, etc.
So it's a kind of consequentialism that is often implicit in these debates, only looking at the consequences, whereas you're more in favor of a more categorical point of view, or there are certain principles that you should respect regardless of the consequences.
Yes, I mean, I am much more perceptive of the fact that we relate to children because of certain understandings we have of children, because of a particular vision we have of children. How we look at children now is different from how we looked at them 50 years ago. So those things change. We've also changed our understandings of, for example, the particular relationship between a father's and a mother's role in the household. So the classical idea of father as the household's law, a father knows best, those the so-called authoritarian model, those things have changed. We change our ways of looking at children and parents. It's more from this idea we have about what does it mean to have a good children's life today that we can talk about these things. My point also being that not all things can be decided decisively or definitively. And that is also, which is part of my distinction that I try to make between parenting and raising children. What is lacking in the parenting account of raising children is some idea of the world in which we are introducing our children. I, as a parent, I am not just performing behaviors in relation to my child in function of certain outcomes, hoping that certain positive outcomes will develop. Obviously, I want my children to thrive, to do well. And obviously, I do certain things and I say certain things of which I hope that they have certain effects. This is part of, let's say, my being as a parent. But there is so much more in relation to my child that is happening, so much more in my being a parent that is happening. We as parents represent a particular kind of world to our children. And this representation essentially functions through a form of exemplarity. That exemplarity is not something that we can be completely transparent about. We just don't know what it is beforehand, not even in retrospect, what it is to our children that we have represented or are representing. For example, it's in these questions that children can raise to you. For example, why do we eat meat? Or why don't we eat meat? And you can give explanations to your child, give answers to your child, but at some point, you just can't explain everything anymore. We convey certain things and ideas to our children. We stand for something, we represent a particular form of communal life. And what our children do with that is something that we fundamentally do not have under our control. In the parenting account, one of the main elements there is the expectation is created that we can have under control the growing up of our children. And I think that is a fundamental misconception of this parenting account.
So the problem is a kind of reduction of raising children to parenting. And critics will speak about a parenting culture. The question is then, why have we, because I assume that it has not always been the case, we have shifted from raising children to parenting children?
There are a few explanations or a few ways of understanding that. I'll start with what one of my own former professors, has once said to me. His name is Bas Levering. He's a Dutch professor of philosophy of education. He pointed to a particular demographic change. So at a certain point in our West European, Anglo-American history, there have been demographic changes which had to do with birth control. At a certain point, we were able to plan the number of children, to plan our family life more than before. What is part of his story is also a secularization and the way we have come to think about family life and about having children. So at a certain point, we were able to control that. We'll just have two, for example, and not like the big families that we had before, 6, 7, 8 or so. And then I will never forget this. Then he said, when you got 7, 8 or 9 children, when there's something off with one of your children, it's not that big of a deal because that child just goes with the flow. There is a big family who take care of that child. With this changed conceptions of family life, we've also developed a sense, he said, that it has to be right. If I'm only going to have two, it has to go well. They have to do well. I want them to do well. So children have become more and more of an investment rather than something that happens to you as a family or as a couple. So that is one of the reasons that he mentions children have become more of an investment. So investing means investing in good parenting behaviors also to make sure that your child does well.
It reminds me a bit of the famous line by the historian Philippe Ariès Lefenroy, so that the child as king. Yeah. The child has become one for whom you do everything, or you have to invest everything. You're, as you said, that the parent becomes a parenter, someone who's just there to make sure that nothing negative happens that would prevent the child from a normal experience of growing up.
And if I may come back to the technologies, the parenting apps, for example. So, and this is something that I've learned from Zygmunt Bauman. Bauman speaks of the compartmentalization of our lives. We have managed to compartmentalize specific pieces and parts of our life. It's far easier, obviously, to deal with the next cold or the next step you take. That is something that we can live with, Bauman has said, and analyze much more than this vague existential angst that we sometimes experience. You can't deal with how is the future going to be? I don't know, but this big monster, the future that is unknown. So Bauman in his analysis says we've compartmentalized our lives to make that manageable. And the technology that is mediating the parent-child relationship, for example, through parenting apps, for me is also part of this modern activity of compartmentalizing our lives. And in this case, it's compartmentalizing the different parts of the relationship with my child. There's well-being, there's the physical development, and there's the next step, etc., etc. So there's this notion of controllability.
Both these two angles, Bauman and investment angle, let's put it that way, stress that it's a kind of cultural shift. But I can imagine that it's not just culture shifting, but that it's also a different role of the state, of the schools, who are more and more interested in the lives of children and intervening in how parents should deal with children. Is that also part of this reason why it has shifted to this parenting culture?
Yes, although I also think we need to be sensitive to different national contexts. I think what you are saying applies more and extensively more so, I think, for a UK context than for our context here. Obviously, here parents are also expected to engage with their children's learning, for example, by supporting homework. But the discourse in the UK seems to be much more strict there. It seems to be that parents are much more governed in relation to educational aims, educational goals. Interesting analyses have been done there by my colleagues here, Matthias de Kuiper, but also in the UK context, Ben Williamson, on the use of digital platforms that form a bridge between school and family. Digital platforms such as ClassDojo, etc. And their analysis show that there are processes at work which govern parents and children in very particular ways, tailored to educational outcome. I think the notion they use is data variance and datafication of children. The particular way in which parents are asked to look at their children, to relate to their children, there is supported by, enhanced by digital platforms such as ClassDojo.
So in that sense, the child-parent relation is politicized?
When we Hutchin and myself use the notion of politicization and depoliticization, they have to be seen from, let's say, different disciplinary contexts or research contexts. But the notion of politicization in the context of the sociology of education, for example, and the critical sociological literature, is used to point to a sort of political appropriation of parents. It's a use of parents by social policies in function of particular aims which are political and not necessarily related to what a parent thinks is good for a child or what a parent wants for her children. I'm thinking here of, for example, teenage pregnancies, drug abuse, the abuse of alcohol and stuff. Overweight. Frank Furedi, the sociologist, has put this very sharply. Parents are here used as tools for social policy. So it's easier to target parents and tell parents, don't feed your kids that rubbish, or to tell parents, make sure you don't get any alcohol in house, than to change on a structural level, on a systemic level, on a societal level, to change nutritional habits, for example, or to do something about food prices, or to regulate the companies that are providing schools with sodas, for example. So in that sense, I've really said parents are used as tools for social policy, and they call it a politicization of parents.
But in your own work, you describe particularly these parenting apps also as a depoliticization. Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's because of my understanding of what it means to raise children. So just think back about what I said about parents always having this kind of representational function. They represent something to their children. Now, this representational function is, but to me, it's obviously related to a community. What I represent is not just something I solipsistically represent. I am always already bound to communal uses of words, of language, of habits, of practices, etc. So I represent something that I share with other people. Now, insofar as parenting apps draw people in the feedback loop between the data they enter and the knowledge available, insofar as that is happening, then parents are, you could say, to a certain extent, drawn away from this embodied community in which they live. I should add another thing there. In parenting apps, options for being disrupted, interrupted, are very limited. Basically, the only thing you can do is just to remove the app from your telephone or just to ignore it. But in the app itself, there is a certain mechanism at work, a certain algorithm that offers you basically a picture of yourself, of your own child as you have entered the data. In the real flesh and life community that I'm talking about, that parents are being part of. And fundamentally, for me, what it means to belong to a community is that you are able to be disrupted, interrupted by someone else. And your children are notably one of those persons that can interrupt you, disrupt you. I sometimes say children are a disruption of a parent's life because you really have to rearrange your own life. Now, in these apps, you are presented a datafied version of your child and yourself. So whatever appears there can hardly interrupt you in the sense like, or in the same ways, like a real person can interrupt you. So your child is curated as a datafied version of something that the algorithm generates. What we mean by depoliticization is in fact this: you are as a parent, you are to a certain extent disconnected from the real life community in which there are real life persons that can interrupt, disrupt, question, contest what you say, agree also, or disagree with what you say. But all those options, those processes, which are for me fundamental to what it means to belong to a community, seem to be neutralized in the use in parenting apps. So hence, that's why we speak of depoliticization, or the risk of a depoliticization.
So what many of these criticisms have in common is indeed that the problem is instrumentalization of parents for a kind of very specific or seemingly specific goal of parenting, where it is assumed that it is clear what a child should be and that all of its needs, wants, and goals are transparent, and all these notions. What would be a kind of alternative scenario of raising the children? Would these apps have any place in that, or would you rather prefer them to slowly, perhaps at least, disappear?
I might change my mind on this in a couple of years from now. I don't know. But for now, I am really inclined to say, get rid of them. You don't need them. Let me very quickly give two reasons. One has to do with the fact that parents seem to be losing out whether or not they are using it. I mean by that, yes, some support the use of parenting apps, but at the same time, some parents are criticized for using their smartphone too much, too often, when they are together with their children. Young mothers watching on their smartphone while breastfeeding. And then the critique was they should not do that because then your children miss out on a lot of non-verbal cues that you as a mother, a feeding mother, interact with your child. Another form of critique is also the use of smartphone when you're sitting around the table for dinner or lunch, etc. So parents are obviously known for using their smartphone as well. So it's kind of a double bind. I mean, for parents. If you use them, you should use them because of all the information that's in there. But if you use them too much, then you're not attuned enough to your child. So that's one reason. I mean, apparently as a parent, you can never win that argument. But when I say just get rid of them, is that call me old-fashioned. And I guess my philosophical education has something to do with that. But we need the concrete live face of the other to interact with one another as human beings. To me, that's fundamental, that we relate to one another and look one another in the eye as human beings. And also appreciate that I can never know everything about you, whatever the knowledge we have, the psychology, the neuropsychology, or whatever knowledge we have says about you as a child, I as a parent can never know everything about you. You are fundamentally an other, let's say, opaque to me. And it's your otherness that should drive me in wanting to relate to you, in wanting to get to know you. It's this concreteness of the face of the other that I think we really need in order to have a human relationship between parents and children.
So ideally, a society without these apps, but do you think they will disappear?
I don't think so. I think there will be, can be expected that there will be just like the next better version of the app. So like with these parenting manuals, they usually start with, all these parenting manuals up till now, they told you this, but this is now the book that will tell you how to deal with your children. So it'll be the same with the parenting apps, I guess. So there will be next versions which claim to be better than the previous ones, which gives you even more personalized information tailored to your child's needs, etc., etc. So no, I don't think they will disappear.
They are here to stay. So parenting apps are surprisingly philosophical in that sense. They provoke a number of questions about what it means to parent or to raise a child. What kind of implicit normativity of what it means to grow up is present in these apps. And these were very fascinating points. I think we learned a lot. Thank you, Stefan, for joining us and talking about this fascinating topic. And I hope to see you again in a future episode.
Thank you.